on the ballot, that really does take away from the rest of the folks that didn't participate. Their chance for maybe voting for someone that they would prefer and represent them. And again, going back to that first, second, or third choice, because you would feel comfortable as a voter for one of those folks. Also, kind of dealing with what David said relating to the spoiler effect. If you voted for that third person, they're being represented, feel more engaged, and have some more confidence in the electoral process, really representing them or at least giving them a chance to have their voice heard. There's also been a number of studies that have shown that this is an interest of mine, that a lot of women of color, or women, and also candidates of color have a better chance of prevailing in ranked choice voting elections. Again, just kind of for what reason that David mentioned, that the elections processes really focus on policy versus telling people why they shouldn't vote for other people, because you're trying to encourage people to support you as a second or third choice. They're usually less vitriolic than the studies have shown. And so I also think that people, the voters, would feel more comfortable with a process that, especially nowadays, is less divisive, less vitriolic, and really focuses on policies and what can this person do for me if I vote for them. So those are just a few of the additional reasons why I believe ranked choice voting is, at least we get through the pilot, see how it works, see how the voters like it. It's not about the candidates. It's not, I mean, in fairness, it is a new thing for the elections officials, but for me, it's always about what is in the best interest of the voter. Do they feel that they're being heard? And does this give them a chance of feeling like they're being heard and maybe want to participate a little bit more ardently in our processes? But, anytime we try something new, it is challenging. When we brought vote by mail, it was a bit of a challenge, but I think we can get through this. I think we need to give voters a bit more credit than sometimes we as elected officials or others give them, because once they get the hang of something, then as we kind of saw with Payson and Figure, they jump into it and they enjoy it.
All right, other side of the coin, what are the downsides? Nothing is a perfect system. There's always goods and bads. So what are the downsides to ranked choice voting? And not necessarily means we shouldn't do it because there's downsides, because like I said, every system has upsides and downsides, but what are the potential problems? Representative, you can write for them, so I'm going to kick it to you.
All right. Well, I am noticing even this year as I'm watching it, just different dynamics. The fact that we're eliminating a primary, anytime it's difference, then you change a system, it changes some of the rules and some of the ways that we normally do things. So watching it this year, without having a primary, what I noticed in the past is, and I'll go back to the example of, a multi-winner race, and not all municipalities are doing multi-winner races because a lot of municipalities have their councils split into districts and so forth. But what you got with a primary, especially in these smaller races where they maybe don't have a lot of funding to do polling, the primary gave everyone an idea of where everyone was at. In my very first election, my first election I lost, but my second election, I was running for a second time, and in the primary, there was the top two winners were going to get in, and in the primary, I came in third, and it really lit a fire under me. Whereas the person that came in first, he kind of thought that he had it made and kind of sat on his laurels. I kicked it into high gear. I campaigned extra hard, and in the general election, I came in first, and he came in third. So, so the lack of the primary, I'm seeing a lot of nervousness with our candidates because they don't have, it's like going into halftime, knowing what the score is, and saying, oh, let's make some halftime adjustments. We don't have that this year, so a lot of the candidates are nervous. They don't know how this is going to affect their election. They don't know what's going to happen. We have some candidates, and sometimes you might have for a municipal election, 10 or 12 candidates sign up, and in a primary, you kind of eliminate candidates that maybe aren't working, and so now you kind of know, like, here's our here's the people that we have. So I think that's one effect is, as you know, how does it change the dynamic of election when we eliminate the primary? And also, I think the candidates don't necessarily know how best to, to navigate this new system, how to campaign right, some of those kind of things. So that's one part of it. I think the understanding on the part of the public whether or not this is going to, be confusing or not. I think that's something that remains to be seen. So there's a lot of questions that still need to be answered, which again is why I'm glad that we're doing it on a limited pilot.
So dovetailing onto that, one thing that I want to let people know is that when you get your ballot, and then you can probably address the number of people that people can rank, because I know it is different in Salt Lake County. I don't know if Utah County has a distinction on the number of people that rank, because the idea of a 12 candidate slate is formidable and it can be overwhelming. But number one, you don't have to rank everybody on your ballot. If you don't want to, you can rank who you want. In fact, if you don't want to rank anyone, you can just vote for the one person that you want to vote for. That's how strongly you feel about the people on the ballot. But there are some distinctions in terms of if you have a large slate of candidates, how many people can be ranked, and then kind of going into the tabulation process. So I'll let you address that so they know.
Yeah, specifically in terms of tabulation, and thankfully this won't be a concern this year because we aren't in any races or situations where it's getting an issue, but there is a potential software limitation in terms of ranking up to 10 candidates in a particular race. And again, the max we're seeing this year right now is 8 candidates in one race in Sandy. So that's not going to be an issue. If there were more, if there were 12 or 15 or what have you, we'd have to say, you can rank 10. Thankfully that's not a problem this year. I guess to kind of answer the larger question, the downside, and I don't know if I call it a downside. I think of it more as a challenge, and I'm harping on the subject a little bit, but wanting to make sure that voters are voting their full ballot, they're voting to the extent that they're able to do so. So you mentioned a situation where maybe someone feels strongly about a particular candidate and only wants to vote for that candidate, and that's fantastic. If that's what they want to do, where I'm coming from is I want to make sure that people understand I can rank those 8 candidates, I can rank those 6 candidates. And to understand that, maybe ranking all of my favorite candidate 8 times isn't going to be to that candidate's benefit. To understand how that process works so that they're getting the most out of the elections they possibly
So all the council wants to do that.
Sure, yeah, you can only vote for the other one.
That's right.
That's always true. It's really interesting because we look at New York City just used ranked choice voting for their primary election for their mayoral race. And I can't remember the exact number is, I should know, but I know there were 13 candidates in the Democratic race. And you could only rank up to whatever it was, 6 or 7, something like that. So there are some limitations on that. Representative talked about a lot of people running. I know in Minneapolis, another city that used ranked choice voting, they had 30 candidates on their ballot for mayor. So that leads me to another question. In Utah, we do vote by mail. All of our jurisdictions are vote by mail. So when we talk about other jurisdictions that are using ranked choice voting, I'm not aware of another one that isn't all vote by mail state. So what is interesting there to you, or is there anything that jumps out to you that makes ranked choice voting in a vote by mail state different than going into a polling location? Because it's really not apples to apples. If we're saying ranked choice voting works great, but no one else is really doing ranked choice voting with all vote by mail. So that does make us a little bit unique there. So are there any challenges you see coming from that combination?
I think that maybe those 2 issues are somewhat independent. Probably the main thing that I would think is just, when you have a number of candidates, whether it's 8 or 6 or, it's just because now you've got to completely format the ballot differently. You've got to have columns for every single candidate where you can rank them, and just the physical space on a paper ballot that you have to mail, I think could be a challenge with, especially if you had a number. I don't know how you do a ranked choice ballot with 30 candidates on a sheet of paper. It would get really confusing. I don't know that it would actually be any easier on an electronic voting machine, though. You'd probably have a lot of the same kind of challenges and limitations.
I think the only thing with the electronic voting machine is the computer won't let you make a mistake. It will tell you if you've messed up. If you're doing that on paper, it's after you turn that in that then the election judges then have to go through what's called the adjudication process, where they try to figure out what you meant. If you crossed out number 6 and said, no, I meant that number 3, and start drawing arrows around that, that gets a little more complicated. One of the things that has come up when we saw this in New York, and we saw this with the conventions last year, is it does take a little bit more time to count these ballots. I can tell you as someone working in the elections office previously, the number one complaint we got about vote by mail is we don't get results on election nights that we're used to. And I guess that's part of the pilot project, but what are your thoughts about that? About, how is the public going to react if it does take longer to count the ballots, to go through these rounds of voting perhaps? Or is that a concern? Is that a problem at all?
Well, I can't speak to public reaction, but
Yeah.
I will say that we do have to anticipate that they will be reported a little bit less frequently, at least in terms of ranked choice contests. So I don't think there's going to be any purely municipalities that have purely ranked choice contests, when we factor in things like service districts and things like that. But there may be a little bit less frequent updates just due to the nature of tabulation. You mentioned adjudication. We do have to adjudicate more frequently in these ranked choice races. And so typically we try to update as little as every 15 minutes, sometimes every half hour on election night. In case of ranked choice, that may be a little less frequent. So again, it goes to the education component, helping people understand refreshing your browser every 2 minutes is not going to get updated results. It may be more like a half hour or an hour.
Well, and turnaround time and the time it takes to get the election results out, it's getting longer and longer. I remember years ago when I was first starting to run, when you would file in August and you'd have a primary in September and general, and it was like a really short turnaround time. But now when we brought in electronic voting machines that have to be reset, and now with mail-in voting, it's just extended the time. And so now you have to register to run for election, for municipal race, I think in June, and then they would have primaries in August. And it's just really early in the process. So the whole election cycle has been lengthened to a large extent. But now you're right, with mail-in voting, getting election results, maybe not those results on election night. If it's not a close race, maybe you do have clarity on election night. But there are some races even today. I remember last year there was one House district here in Salt Lake County that we didn't know for at least 2 weeks, and it was on just the night of the canvass when then that election flipped. And so I think hopefully we don't extend it any further than what it already is. But that was a very, very close race that came down to just a very small percentage of voters. Hopefully that's the exception rather than the rule.
Actually, question. I brought that up. So one of the things that can occur during the canvass period when ballots are being evaluated as to whether they're eligible or not, if there's a challenge with them, somebody forgot to sign it, is that voters do have the opportunity to do what's called cure their ballots. So, oftentimes the clerks will say there's somebody within a party or a canvassee will say, something happened with the ballot. There was, sometimes you send out actual email or letters or something that say, there's been a problem with the signature on the ballot. You have an opportunity to cure it. So yes, getting the result is very challenging as a candidate if you're waiting and you're waiting and you're waiting. But what's in the best interest of the voters, the nice thing about curing the ballot is you have an opportunity to do that. And I'm just kind of wondering how that's going to work, or how do you see that possibly working so people know how they can cure their ballot if there might be a question?
Well, if there is an issue with the ballot, we try to get those out as soon as humanly possible, because we want to make sure that people have that opportunity to cure it and get that back. And those do quite often go out through mail. And so we'd like to get those out as early as possible so people can return them. But it raises an interesting question in terms of if there are a lot of cures or provisional ballots or things like that. that could affect the ranked choice race, because as David mentioned, candidates at various phases of the race are eliminated. So as new ballots come in, that may affect who's eliminated at what phase of the race and whatnot. So again, our education, a big part of that is helping people understand you may see changes, you may see fluctuations in the results of this race, but really until the Board of Canvassers meets after the election, you really cannot say with 100% clarity and confidence that this is the outcome of this race. And so, depending on the number of cure letters that go out, depending on the number of provisional ballots and things like that, it may not change much. But, based on the way that ranked choice votes and ballots are tabulated, it does have the opportunity to have some effect. So we want people to understand, don't wait until the board can. I know that's hard. That's 2 weeks out, but
it's standard practice either way.
Yeah.
It's not called until it's called.
Everyone hates the waiting, but yeah, absolutely. So let's shift this from the municipal level to state level. There's been a lot of discussion about using ranked choice voting at the state level, and particularly using it when it comes to the partisan primary election. We don't have time to go into the whole history, but the quick history is there's an infamous bill, SB 54, that was passed a few years back, that allowed candidates to get to the primary election by gathering signatures. Prior to SB 54, the only way to get to the primary election was through the convention system. So there was never going to be more than 2 candidates on a primary election ballot for any party. We now live in a world where you can have 2, 3, 4, 5, as many people as gather the correct amount of signatures on the ballot for the primary election. We had multiple candidates for governor in 2020 on the Republican ballot. So 2 questions. One, is that a concern? Or why would that be a concern that someone might win the primary election with less than a majority vote? And 2, why would ranked choice voting be a good solution to that, or is ranked choice voting a good solution to that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think one of the, we've been talking about ranked choice voting now for almost a decade now, to Rebecca's point. And I think one of the things that's really spurred ranked choice voting the last couple of years has been SB 54. We saw, Congressional District 1 last cycle, somebody winning 30-something% of the vote. We saw Governor Cox win something like 30-something% of the vote. So it's happening more and more frequently, which is now, I think, the legislature, and Representative Stenquist will speak to this more. The legislature is looking at this and saying, it's plurality an issue. Should we start looking at this for primary elections? So, our group, Utah Ranked Choice Voting favors doing this outside of the municipal project and implementing this for a primary election. So I would say that I think it could be a good solution. I think it could be a way to get somebody to 50%, and to Rebecca's point, get the will of voters, broad consensus.
Well, I think that's a good question, and those conversations have happened. Whether or not this would be an alternative and maybe a compromise that could move us past this controversy over SB 54. But I don't know. I think that really the jury's still out. That's why we're doing this pilot project, because I really would like to see how things go this year with all these municipalities trying it out before we bring it, to the state level or something like that. And I think that possibly we could look at it for a partisan primary where everyone is part of the same party. I think if you tried to introduce it into an election where it was a multi-party race, like a general multi-party race, then I think it gets really confusing. And so I think we're maybe a little ways out before we can get ahead of ourselves and start thinking about doing something like that. But maybe the next logical step would be potentially a partisan primary where this could be used. But again, I think we just need to see how things go for a little while and see how people feel about it.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that the pilot project is slated to run through the end of 2025. That's not repealed until January 1st, 2026. So on the books, we do have plenty of time to work through this and gather data over multiple elections.
I would just like to add, I want to shout out to all of the municipalities that decided to participate this year, because the more that we get municipalities participating in the pilot, the more data we have. It's great because we have urban and rural, large and small this time around. That'll give us, again, better data, better experiences from which to draw. So I always encourage constituents from the cities that aren't trying it this year to talk to start to have conversations with their local city council members, because it's at the prerogative of each individual city to decide whether or not they're going to participate right now. It's not forced. So the legislative body of each municipality has to decide whether or not they want to participate in ranked choice voting. So if your city isn't doing it this time around, please encourage them to do it in 2023 and 2025. The more data we have, the richer the experience will be, not only for voters, but for us to assess what works, what doesn't work, what might need to change.
You know, from the county perspective, is there a difference between using ranked choice voting in a partisan primary versus in a municipal race? What differences does the county see?
You know, I don't know that I'm personally using that much thought, but yeah, absolutely.
I'm glad you used that question.
Spurring money, yeah. No, definitely there will be differences. I mean, the nature of the elections are a little bit different. And so in terms of logistics, probably not a lot, but without giving it more thought, I don't know, I'd give you a great answer.
So you talked about using it in partisan primary. There are a couple of states, Alaska and Maine, who will start using it in the general election. So Representative, you mentioned this, but why would that be so much different? You know, and let me just throw out a scenario. If we really went all in on ranked choice voting, we could get rid of that June primary. We could just throw everything on the ballot in November. Pros and cons about that kind of approach.
Well, I think, you know, that all of the dynamics that would change, I think that would be something that we'd have to really think long and hard about. So, for example, you know, here in Utah, it's a majority Republican state. And so you might end up on a ballot in some parts of the state where you have several Republicans and one or two Democrats on a ranked choice vote ballot, and you know, intermingling those could be interesting. Let me just say that. You know, and you know, you might get people that feel like, well, wait a minute, you know, you might, or heavy Democrat areas where it might open the door to that changing a little bit. I mean, you see what happened just recently in California with their recall election, where you had multiple Republican candidates that were running, and if the question on the ballot was, you know, do you want to recall their governor? If that had passed, then, you know, maybe if you get all of the Republicans that get behind one candidate in a multi-partisan, you know, where there's lots of different candidates from multiple parties, then it opened the door for a Republican to be elected in a state that's heavily Democratic. And so the partisan dynamics of that get really interesting, and it could be very different depending on where you're at and the local environment that you're in.
I think the thing that I would add to is that really calls to the importance of the electorate, the voters, to really get to know who the candidates are. One thing that I do like to remind folks is that unaffiliated voters in Utah are the second largest registration levels. So you've got the Republicans at the highest number of registered voters, but the second highest number of registered voters are unaffiliated voters. So something that I've always worked on when I was working on elections reform is, how do we ensure that unaffiliated voters feel, regardless of where they are on the political spectrum, that their voices are being heard? Now, notably, speaking about what we were talking about earlier in terms of a primary, the Democratic primary, or we run, as a Democrat, we run our party policies a bit differently, where anybody can vote in our primaries. You do not have to be a registered Democrat in order to vote in the Democratic primary. So a ranked choice voting partisan RCV election for the candidate that would represent the Democratic Party on the ballot would be really interesting, because we've got unaffiliated voters hopping in there automatically. But then again, going on the other side of it is, when you've got them as the second largest voting bloc in the state, would it make them feel like they are really involved in the process there's a lot to kind of think through. And so I like the idea also our municipal pilot project because it is nonpartisan. Municipal elections in Utah are nonpartisan elections. And, you know, we're still trying to educate people on that. Sometimes I would talk to people when I'm canvassing for a municipal candidate, they'll say, well, they're a Republican or a Democrat. And I'm like, well, it's a nonpartisan. You have to talk to them, see if, look at their policies, look at how they, you know, what they're pushing forward. That might give you an idea where their ideological leanings might be, but they do not declare a party. So it's kind of interesting to see what might happen in that case.
And one other thing I want to add, you know, our town Utah ranked choice voting is better, faster, cheaper. We did this at the legislature, we said this to the cities we spoke with over the last couple of months. You know, ranked choice voting is better because it saves you money, it's a better experience for voters, it's just a more efficient way to run an election. What we don't want to do is then all of a sudden have, you know, a ranked choice voting election and wholesale changes where somebody gets elected that never would have been elected in the first place and all these crazy wacky results. So we want to just make sure that, and we'll get data to back this up, that it's just a better way to run an election. You know, somebody may have been elected because they're the second choice or something like that. But we don't want to see wholesale changes to the electoral system. That's not our intention. I don't think that's anybody's intention out here. We're supposed to either.
All right, do we have questions from the audience? We're about at that time.
We'd love to get questions from people who are here. Yes.
Okay. I think naturally, as someone who's not as involved with elections as you guys, it's easy to just generally think about presidential elections, that's what we're most familiar with. Do any of you see that ranked vote choice voting could ever happen with the presidential?
I honestly highly doubt it because there's so much at stake and there's so many people invested in the current system. I honestly don't see something like this catching on to that level. That's just my personal opinion. But we'll see. You know, we'll see if it's something that, I mean, it's something that would have to start small and gain a lot of a tremendous amount of popular support before we could look at becoming more widespread and make it into larger races, you know, federal races, especially, you know, or even, you know, large statewide races, I think. But, you know, it's baby steps. And I'll just tell you, you know, I ran a ranked choice bill this year that helped facilitate some of the pilot project that we had. I didn't create the pilot project that goes, you know, that credit goes to Representative Chavez-Houck and Representative Roberts more than me. But mine was more about tweaking things. But I'm really kind of looking at this neutrally. I really want to see what's going to happen and how it's going to affect things. And honestly, if it turns out that people don't like it and it's not popular, then it probably won't go much past this. We'll see.
And if I can just add, I think, and then the alternative is there too. The more that people get used to using it, then it's up to the voters and it's up to those that are governed to say, you know, this is something that we think might better reflect our perspective. Just kind of going back to 2016 when it really kind of caught my eye that we might be ready to start having a discussion about implementing ranked choice voting. What I was seeing is that voters really didn't want to align themselves with either party. You saw, and that's why we have so many unaffiliated voters that you talk to, I believe, is that people don't want to be put in a box. They want to be able to look at a candidate, see what they believe in, see what they will do, and make those judgments accordingly. And I think that if, you know, even looking at that statewide or presidential or congressional level, perhaps it will take some time though.
There, not from us, but there have been murmurs nationally about using it for the presidential primaries because you're seeing, I think it would actually work very well because you're seeing so many times when candidates drop out so frequently.
And Wyoming did that.
Yes, Wyoming did it where you're voting for somebody by the time, you know, it's time to count the ballots in your state, like 2 candidates dropped off, so your votes are essentially just wasted. So they're talking about maybe using it for presidential primaries so you can rank your candidates. And then if somebody drops out, your choice drops out, then they allocate their votes. But from a statewide perspective for the whole election, I think that's way in the future if that would happen.
You know, and if I can chime in on that one, I think what I'm hearing is it's not necessarily that we're trying ranked choice voting on a municipal election And it will definitely get to whatever point. Part of the pilot project could be that we find out it works really, really well in municipal elections, but it doesn't necessarily transfer well over to a statewide, or it may transfer to a primary, but not to a statewide. Or it might make a whole lot of sense in a presidential primary where you do have people dropping out. I mean, even in the days before, and with the vote by mail election, we're sending those ballots out 3 weeks in advance. So there may be areas that make sense, but it doesn't make sense in others, if I'm hearing what everybody's saying.
The next question ties into that a lot. A lot of kind of national organizations that are pushing for ranked choice voting represent us, which is the idea that ranked choice voting can help to break up the duopoly, the strong two-party system that we have, that a lot of people are not satisfied with. Do you see ranked choice voting as leading to a greater chance for that two-party system to fragment a little bit, or is that?
I think it depends on who you ask. I think there's an initiative filed right now. I don't know where it's going or if it's been withdrawn or whether I'm moving on it, where it would essentially do exactly that. They would do what's called a final five, where they would do a nonpartisan primary, and there shouldn't be a partisan primary, but anybody can participate in it. And then they do ranked choice voting for the general election. They're behind that is that it would break up the duopoly, as you say. That's one group pushing it. Other groups have other ways of doing it. I think, everyone thinks that ranked choice voting is going to be the silver bullet to breaking up the duopoly. I don't believe that, and I just think it's a better way to run the election that has the broad consensus of the population, but people have their own theories about what the silver bullet is, quote unquote.
I would say there are so many variables that affect that. I mean, but it's something to explore. So, yeah.
The next question is for you. Earlier you cited studies about women and minorities having a greater chance of being elected in this model. And one person to know, I was wondering if you knew where those studies came from or if they could find it.
Yes, actually, it's a report that was issued by an organization called Represent Women, which is associated with Fair Vote. So if you just look under Represent Women and ranked choice voting elections, sorry, I don't have the direct link on it, but they're the ones, they do conduct this they do this study every 2 years to kind of evaluate the impact of winning and participation of candidates of color and women in elections that are ranked choice voting elections and what your success rate is, but it's Represent Women.
Another question is relates to, ranked choice voting isn't the only way we can go in terms of electoral system reform. A few of you mentioned multi-winner elections, and just doing that, it tends to produce more proportional outcomes in terms of voters' preferences and elected officials being aligned with them. Is expanding multi-winner elections a viable option here in Utah? Is there any talk of that going on here or at national?
Well, a multi-winner race really is something that's baked into the actual, characteristics of the race you're running. Like we had multi-winner races because there were 2 or 3 city council seats that were all at large. But there's no such thing as a multi-winner race for mayor because there's only one mayor. But I think what you're asking is, there's a different method where rather than ranking them, through by your preferences, you could just simply say, I've got 2 or 3 people, I'm okay with all of them. Here's 2 people for mayor, I'm okay with both of them, I'll vote for both of them, and then whoever gets the most votes. Honestly, that's another alternative, certainly. I think that if I was going to vote for more than one person for a particular office, I would prefer to be able to rank my preference. I think that's a little bit better than just saying, yes, I like all of these people equally, because usually we don't like all of them equally. But I like the idea, really, what this comes down to is just innovation in our election systems. I work in the tech industry, that's my day job. And so I love innovation, I love trying out new things. And sometimes you have to experiment, sometimes those experiments are successful, sometimes they're not successful. but at least we're trying to come up with different ways to improve our election systems. You know, right now, there's a lot of contention going on, and I'm personally very concerned about people losing faith in our election systems in general, and whatever we can do to bolster that, to bolster our participation, you know, the fact that we went as a state to mail-in voting, I think has really helped lower some of the barriers to participating in the election system. Because our system of democratic government does not work without, first of all, you have to have people willing to run for these offices and serve, and then you need to have an informed electorate participating in elections. And if you don't have those things, our entire democratic system of government does not work at all. So hopefully this is something that helps the public get engaged.
I just also want to add that aside from ranked choice voting, you know, we should feel very fortunate that we live in Utah and all the innovation that we do here for voting. We've been doing it for so long. I mean, when by mail voting was made such a big deal this year in the election, we've been doing that for years now. We've not experimented, but we've looked at and multiple administrations now for governor looked at possible ways to do online voting. You know, we have same-day registration here, same-day voting. Utah's very cutting edge, if you will, for voting, and I don't think our state gets enough credit for that. So I just want to also.
Yeah, I'll just add to that too. When we first started chatting about ranked choice voting a few years ago, a lot of the pushback came from, well, we're just not ready because the tech's not ready. But the tech has definitely caught up, and I think, just as Representative Stenquist has mentioned, as we get more advancements, as we look at ways to adjust and improve upon the way that we do tabulation or how people cast their ballots. I mean, to me, the sky's the limit. I mean, we have to put guardrails on things and make sure that they're running effectively. But there's ways to continue to make this work, and it's not where we were 5 or 6, 7 years ago when I first brought this out, and the argument was, well, the tech's not there. We don't know whether these will be able to tabulate it correctly.
And our last question is, if you're here or you're watching online and you're interested in having your voice heard on electoral reform, either in favor or against ranked choice voting, what can you do? How can students particularly get involved?
First of all, I'd say the Hinckley Institute of Politics is a great way to get involved, whether it be internships or just getting more information about things. I'll do a plug for our group, Utah Ranked Choice Voting. You can check us out at utahrcv.com. Or just, you know, Google. There's plenty of ways to Google electoral reform, and I guarantee you'll find tons of institutions or groups that are getting involved in this stuff. And also just volunteer candidates too.
The thing that I would add is, again, if you want to see this in your city, talk to your city council members now. Often what happens is when they're thinking about looking at it, which is right before the municipal elections, is sometimes where it percolates in their brain, then it's harder to get them to decide. So after this election, say, wow, it was really great that that neighboring city got to try out ranked choice voting. Let's keep going here. Let's make it happen in our city. So help us encourage other cities to participate.
And as always, you can always contact your elected officials.
Great. Well, we'd like to thank our panelists and our moderator for a great discussion today.